Good evening, everyone. My name is Grace Oxley, and I'm a first-year MVP student here at the Harris School of Public Policy. We are proud to have Dr. Damon Jones as our keynote speaker for the annual Georgiana Rose Simpson Seminar. Dr. Jones attended Stanford University, where he received his BA in Public Policy in 2003. He then went on to earn his PhD in economics at the University of California, Berkeley, completing his thesis on taxation, transfers, and consumption soothing. During that time, he was awarded the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship and the Ford Foundation's Predoctoral Fellowship. Soon after completing his PhD, Dr. Jones returned to Stanford as a postdoctorate fellow while also holding an affiliated research position at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Upon completing his postdoctoral fellowship in 2010, Dr. Jones earned a faculty research position with the National Bureau of Economic Research, while simultaneously beginning his career at the Harris School of Public Policy as an assistant professor. Jones's research focuses on the intersection of public finance, household finance, and behavioral economics. Dr. Jones also served on Joe Biden's Presidential Transition Agency Review Team to support the efforts related to the Council of Economic Advisors. Outside of his research, Dr. Jones is a dedicated teacher and mentor, as evident by his membership on the board of directors of the W.E. Du Bois Scholars Institute. Dr. Jones is currently the only Black tenure-track associate professor at Harris, and for many of the Black students there, he has been a crucial supporter and mentor, continually making time to listen, talk with, and validate their experiences. The Black Grad Coalition, BAPS, and MIPS are very excited to introduce the Georgiana Rose Simpson keynote speaker, Dr. Damon Jones. Join us as we welcome Dr. Jones.
Thanks for that great introduction. Thanks for having me today. It's an honor to get to share some time with you guys and to share this space with you graduate students. I'm also happy to see a lot of the students from the Harris School. I was just thinking one of the downsides of the many downsides of the pandemic is that, for first year students, I usually see them around the hallways or, I see them around. So with a whole year without being in person, I just don't bump into people as much. So yeah, I definitely miss those types of interactions. So happy to be here today. I'm looking forward to the question and answers that you guys will have. So I'm gonna try not to take up too much time. I'm gonna try to keep my comments brief. I was asked to speak about my experience in academia, my career experience, in particular being one of a Black economist in a field where we're sort of in a minority. So I'm going to make some brief remarks. The event is named after Georgiana Rose Simpson, and so I made sure I was familiar with the name, but I made sure to look up and try to do a little more fact finding about Georgiana Rose Simpson. And my wife actually shared with me an exhibit from the library, University of Chicago Library, called Integrating the Life of the Mind, African Americans at the University of Chicago, 1870 to 1940. I'm gonna pull for a little bit from that exhibit, which was created by some researchers with the Black Metropolis Research Consortium. So some of my historical facts about the university are gonna be coming from there. So I'm just going to jump around and talk about a couple themes with my experience in academia and being an economist. And so I think that in general, for you graduate students in these types of spaces and doing your doctoral studies or your master's studies, but depending on the institution you're at, you're going to find yourself being potentially among the few, but in terms of your race. And so you'll have these experiences that are going to be unique and sometimes unfair. So I want to talk a little bit about how I've navigated that, some of the things I've learned. One of the first things with being quote unquote one of the only ones, or being one of a few, or being the first in this or that field, or studying to be on a faculty or this place, that place, is that this can add to one part of graduate school, especially with doctoral studies that you go through, which is there's a good deal of loneliness in research, in part because there's a lot of individual work that's done. There's a lot of long spells of sort of just diving deep into your work, maybe like sacrificing different types of social interactions and things like that. So grad school in general can be lonely. And for a Black graduate student in particular, you're going to find yourself maybe experiencing additional loneliness because of the fact that, at least with respect to your race, there may not be as many people that can relate to you or that you can relate to in that dimension. And so that can be one of the things that I'm going to refer to as unfair. And so, you know, in the long run, these types of spaces need to have fundamental changes in how welcoming they are, how inviting they are, how supportive they are. And, you know, that will generate differences in who's there, the makeup of these places, the makeup of your faculty, the makeup of your graduate cohorts and things like that. So in the long run, those things need to happen. That's beyond the scope of my talk, at least today, because those things take time to change. In the short run, in the meantime, you know, you're still here, you need to make it through somehow, some way. So when I was in grad school, I found myself in that meantime position until the field of economics changes. I had to get through my program. One key lesson that I found was that I needed to draw on people beyond just my local proximity. So I was in a graduate program, you know, there were people in my classes ahead of me, my faculty and things like that. And, you know, I had a lot of great instruction, great mentoring, great training for research, but some things just weren't going to come from my department. I just had to accept that. I had to cast a wider net in order to make it out. So I had to supplement whatever resources were in my own department with what was available outside. So that could be across the university. For me in economics, you had to go further than that because that wasn't going to be enough. So I had to sort of build a network with other Black economists from around the country. And I didn't have to build it, I had to join one. Luckily, that was already in place. So there had been people who had sort of put these things in place at a national level, convenings and organizations that I could join where I met other Black economists, maybe like in my second year in grad school. And that really just, that was really eye-opening and changed my, I was doing well in my studies, but I had never just sort of been in a place where the majority of people were Black and studying economics. And that really changed things for me. I couldn't generate that at my university. Maybe one day where I went to graduate school will be like that, but it, you know, it just wasn't possible. So I had to go outside of that space. So, and, you know, looking back at some of like early, this exhibit that I looked at, they had sort of who were the early alumni of the University of Chicago. And so, you know, I found like with Georgiana Simpson, as was mentioned, obviously for students around her time, they had a very like isolating experience. She was not able to live in the dorms because they didn't want the dorms integrated. There's a story that I happen to know a little bit about. Someone who was probably her contemporary, someone named Cecilia Johnson. She was a student at the University of Chicago. She had basically, the local newspapers had done a story about her, one claiming that she was trying to pass as a white student, and also they wrote about how one of her family members was a local crime boss. And so it's probably true that her family member was a local crime boss, but you know, who doesn't have some crime bosses in their family? Who among us? So, but you know, it actually turns out like I couldn't find what actually happened, but I don't think that she finished her undergrad here. I think she did come back to do a master's, but that was the type of isolating experience she had. But then there were other people like Katherine Dunham, who was a scholar and an artist and a dancer. And you read about her experience when she was here at the University of Chicago. And you find that in addition to what she did on campus, she found community off campus in the arts community around the South Side, with other contemporaries like Margaret Walker, who was at Northwestern University. And so those were other examples that like resonated with me. The second thing I want to talk about for Black graduate students, scholars, and researchers such as myself is that in these spaces, I think in general, when you're in a field where there's very few, and then given the types of backgrounds that we tend to have, I think what I found for myself at least is that part of my motivation in doing my studies was that I, you know, felt like, okay, maybe I have some purpose that I'm trying to achieve. When I was thinking about what I wanted to study when I was an undergrad and going into graduate school, I wanted to study social sciences because I was interested in social problems like inequality and racism. I was interested in knowing how could we solve those things. And so part of my motivation for what I study and the topics I looked at was in part motivated by my background and experience growing up and seeing inequality or experiencing racism and things like that. And so I think that one thing that is sometimes common among Black graduate students is part of the motivation for what they do is this like sort of higher calling or some greater purpose than simply just being a good researcher or, you know, just in general feeding a curiosity. There's also like maybe some yearning for justice or, you know, having a positive impact on society. I think that's good, but there's also a question, as I mentioned, that word unfair again is a question about, do people view that as a fair thing? It is difficult enough just to finish grad school, just to be a normal student who passes your classes or graduates or submits a thesis. But above and beyond that, there's some expectation that, well, maybe what you're doing is also going to have this, you know, big impact on society. So that actually kind of raises the stakes. And, you know, I think there's a valid question to be asked about, is that fair or not? Does that introduce undue burden? I think, like, I'm of two minds. I do think that it's unfair, but I think it's okay. Because I think that, you know, who else, you know, when I talk to some of my mentors about this type of position, you may find yourself in the questions like, who else is going to do that? Or who else is going to take up that sort of call? And so you might find yourself in that position and think that it's unfair, you know, compared to maybe some of your peers. Like, I'm additionally expected to do not just well, but, you know, uplift an entire community or something like that. And I'm going to come back to that expectation, but that may seem unfair. That may, you know, raise the stakes, but I think it's also like you have a privilege in being in that position to have your experience and have the opportunities that you have and try to meld those together to kind of guide what you do. Looking back at some of the other alumni in its early period of the University of Chicago, Carter G. Woodson was an alum of the university. And you read about his work and, you know, his scholarship, especially as he, you know, became more established in his career, was focused on history. But at that time, you know, as he referred to it, Negro life and history. But, you know, he had a goal in mind that was about correcting misinformation in society and trying to like use truth and the pursuit of truth to try to like rectify certain social problems in society, especially as it related to Black people and African Americans. So, you know, that's an example of a scholar where this kind of calling kind of fueled them. I will say one thing about this purpose, though. While it is an opportunity, a unique opportunity, maybe it's something that not all your peers can relate to. I will say this, that one thing I have learned is that goal of having this impact on society or having some positive impact, like it is elusive, especially if you want to go into academia. It's something that you don't have full control over. You may think that there's a clear path to having a positive impact on society. You may think like, okay, if I study these types of topics or if I do this type of work, it for sure will change things. And that's just not at all guaranteed. And especially when you go into academia, there's a very circuitous route. Okay, you have to jump through a lot of hoops before you can even get your footing and maybe be in command of what you know, have more like agency over what you're studying, what you're doing, where you're spending your time. It can be rewarding, but you may never actually see what the impacts are of what you do. It may not be clear at this time that how you did something affected something else. And so you may eventually get there, but for me, it took years to maybe even feel like I'm in that type of position. So you just have to expect that, especially if you're going to go through the through academia, through the doctoral, and the research and the research route. The other thing is like what you decide to do and focus your time on is also not clear, like what is going to have the most impact. And so you may think, oh, there are certain types of topics that are most obviously liberatory or revolutionary, but that's not at all clear either. And so a lot of times we find ourselves, what we do or what we focus on may not be obvious to people or interesting to people. I studied tax policy. Every time I tell my father that I studied tax policy, he kind of like nods off and starts snoring in my face. So, but, you know, tax policy has a lot to do with inequality and redistribution. But at times, things I'm looking at may be, you know, small or, you know, very detail oriented or tedious or unclear how they may have an impact on the world. But, you know, you don't have full control over when these things will have this impact. And part of what you're doing is a combination of what you're good at, what you're interested in, what hasn't been done before. And so I think there is this pressure to say, okay, what is your, like for a Black researcher, there's a question about what is your research doing for Black people? And, you know, I think it's okay if you don't, like, if you can't answer that, like, you may not have the answer now about how that is the case. And I'm going to talk about something you can do to where you have more control over what happens than maybe just necessarily what your research does. So, but before I get to that, some more historical examples that relate to this. So like Carter G. Woodson, I just talked about all he did with history, Negro life and history, but you know, his thesis was on European history. And that was like what was acceptable when he was sort of submitting his degree. And it wasn't until he got later in his career and, you know, began to have his own agency that he shifted his focus and, you know, looked at Negro History Week, which became Black History Month, which is what we are here now in part because of gathering for. And so, but, you know, there's a roundabout way to get to where you're ultimately going to end up. And in academia, it is very roundabout. With Georgiana Rose Simpson, you know, her research was on German Romanticism and poetry. She studied philology, which is something that I didn't know what it meant until a couple days ago. But so, you know, if you look at her thesis and what she looked at, I mean, she was studying things that were related to German culture, art, humanities in that context. Later on in her career, she did a translation of a biography of Toussaint Louverture. So, but I say that to say that for someone like her who has had impacts on some of you today, it may not have been clear why her studying German Romanticism would have led to some sort of impact. And it's not necessarily something that should discourage you from what you may find yourself studying, even if it's not obvious that it will have that impact on the Black community. But the final thing I want to say about that impact is part of what motivates us to think about this impact is that we, the model we have typically is informed by even when we talk about quote unquote Black excellence, the model is usually informed by this measure of individual success. So when we're thinking about, okay, am I gonna, you know, serve some purpose? Am I gonna succeed at that? If that's why I came into this field and I don't feel like I'm having an impact, is that a failure? If I don't become known for changing some conversation or transforming some space or area or thought or something like that. And like I said, you don't have a lot of control over that. There's a lot of things that you don't have control over that will lead to whether or not that is the case at the individual level. But that's what we're normally primed to celebrate. Even in this history that I looked at, the history of the, you know, early alum of University of Chicago, you know, a lot of what is focused on is like these unimaginable obstacles that people overcame to become, you know, brilliant scholars at the individual level. Like Benjamin Mays, you know, he went on to be, have a very successful career at Morehouse and mentored Martin Luther King and eulogized Martin Luther King. He's a University of Chicago alum. Spoiler alert, we may not become Benjamin Mays or Georgiana Rose Simpson. I'm sorry to break it to everybody. That we may not have control over, but we can have an alternative measure of excellence that is like based on collective effort. Okay, so in addition to what you do that you may be individually recognized for, you can also think about how you can join more collective efforts to try to improve things. And, you know, as an economist, the most common thing people ask me is, what kind of investment should I do? What kind of stock should I invest in? I never have any investment advice for anyone. But in this case, time is an investment too. So I think like there's a safe bet and investing some of your time in these collective efforts. They're more likely to have it's more likely how things change with these collective efforts. Even these stories we see about these, laudable scholars or these notable scholars, there's a bunch of people that contributed to where they ended up. So these measures of excellence include a lot of people who are not recorded, who do normal things that contribute to a larger collective effort. Right? So you don't necessarily have to get the Nobel Prize or get nominated for it to have some fulfilling impact, especially if you're part of a larger group where part of your success is in the process of building a community, working together. So some of that is like what you're doing with the Black Graduate Collective, but in general, you need to counterbalance these models of individual success and excellence with more collective outcomes. And the last thing I'll say is that the final way in which I feel like I can, have some impact where it's most obvious is not like with my research or changing society, but in part it's just like having been in a unique position as a Black economist or a Black faculty member in academia is like the people who are where I was a few years ago are also trying to navigate that same path with very few guideposts. And the lessons I've learned, even from failing or not being successful, are like hugely valuable to them. So like the most gratifying thing or easiest thing I can do is with mentorship to other scholars or students. And so part of where I see like my time best spent is investing in people in earlier stages. And some of that is like investing in people who are younger, but it's not necessarily about age. It's in part just about where you are and have I already, maybe been through a certain experience and what can I share with people. So I have people who are high school students that I, invest in, but other students who are older than me, who, are, just beginning their studies, maybe incarcerated, but, like there's having hindsight and sharing that with other people probably is the easiest way to try to peck away at that like desire to have some sort of some impact or serve some purpose. And then you could see like with Georgiana wrote Simpson, even while she was, now this may be not ideal, or maybe this is just a feature of the constraints she faced, but in any event, while she was finishing her graduate studies at Chicago, she was teaching at Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C., which is it has like a number of prominent graduates that came out of, that high school, and, many of them were probably influenced by her as well. And so part of her legacy is that part and that type of work, in addition to what she did, with her studies and her research. So let me stop there. Happy to start having Q&A. I finished right on time, 4:58. That was what was on the spreadsheet for the timeline.
Yes, you did, sir. Thank you so much for that. And so previously we had students submit questions for us to ask you. And so therefore I asked you those questions. And the first question that I have on the list is, given how far you have come in your career, what is some advice that you would give to your younger self looking back and how to expedite your career, how to make it further in the field?
I think some of the key things I've learned, like I'm speaking now about like in academia, graduate school, as a faculty member. In academia, you get to stages in your life and then you need to become like, you have to be promoted. And a lot of that involves satisfying some requirements, but basically convincing some other people you are ready to be promoted. So am I ready to advance to candidacy? Am I ready to get a PhD or doctorate degree? Am I ready to make it past my mid-tenure review? Am I ready to get promoted to tenure, full professor, all of these things? In those cases, I think you need to try to figure out, like, your life is gonna be much easier. You need to find some advocates for your case. So those may be your mentors. They may be unlikely people in the sense that maybe they're not the person who studies exactly what you study, but you need to look around and try to figure out, okay, I've interacted with all these people. This person I have very positive interactions with. They seem like I can trust them. They seem like they will probably go to bat for me. You need some people like that to help, make a pathway for you. So like one of the questions that you asked, that people ask is like, how is it being the only Black tenure track faculty at Harris School? So I wasn't always the case. When I got to the Harris School, Kerwin Charles was also a Black economist at the Harris School. So he was there the whole time I was there until like a couple years ago. So I had somebody I trust that mentored me, that could advocate for me. That was key in trying to have success. So that definitely was one thing I had to figure out who's going to be somebody that's kind of going to be like your cheerleader. And like I said, you may need to think broadly about, okay, is that in my department? Is it outside of my department? You may need to go elsewhere to figure out who's going to be some of these people that are on your team. But that's key, because I think what happens is once you have that person, you need to get an honest description of what is expected to proceed. I think you can show up and you can say, I think I know what people want, and you can work on that. And then when you get to a certain stage, everyone kind of says, this is not what we had in mind. So at least be clear about what people are expecting from you. You can decide, is that what I want to do? Is that where I want to spend my time and do it? But that information is going to be key too.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Another question that was submitted is that in the past, you have served on the board of directors for the W.E.B. Du Bois Scholars Institute. We were wondering, what do you think are ways in which you can promote Black youth to pursuing careers in economics?
Yeah, so two things that come to mind for that. One is economics is like, it's kind of like you're driving down the highway and it's like, okay, if you want to merge onto this additional highway, like here's your exit. And if you go past that exit, like to get back to that other highway, like could be very difficult. Like, I don't know, the example is I'm from New Jersey. So like, you drive on a New Jersey turnpike. If you miss your exit, you're going to be on the turnpike for a while before you can make a U-turn and get back. All right. So the point is that the earlier you know about your options for economics or what you need to do, the better chance you have to succeed. So a lot of people who are successful, I look around at my colleagues, a lot of them, their parents are professors. They may have been, alerted to the option of economics early on. I hear people discussing now, like, okay, if you do this in high school, you have a good chance to get an economics. Now, who is thinking about that at high school, right? Like, I didn't know what a PhD was or what it entailed when I was in high school. I didn't know about what you could do with an economics degree until later in my career. So I was late to the game. So a lot of Black people, because there's not a critical mass, economics doesn't present itself as a natural pathway. And then you decide, oh, I might be interested in economics around my senior year in college. And then it's very hard to break into the field if you just realize that at that point. So I think people need to know about these options early and know, like, okay, if you go into economics, you can study like justice in the law enforcement system. You can study, migration. You can study, I don't know, tons of interesting topics. It's not just about like finance and, literally about money. It's a social science where you study how people make choices, and that can be applied in a wide range of areas. But people don't know that early on, and it's hard to get back into. So you kind of need to put people on early in their career, but also the environment in the field would need to change. So right now it's just kind of hostile and not completely inviting or welcoming. It's not very diverse. So that needs to change to get like a critical mass to come into economics, because the people who have the background and are prepared to go into it, it's like, is it worth it to them to do this and spend their valuable time here if it's not going to be welcoming or inclusive? So that would have to change first before you could feel good to just steer people in mass into thinking about economics. But yeah, so I think those are two things that need to happen.
Thank you for sharing that. Now, my next series of questions are going to more veer towards your career. And so in the past, you have served as a volunteer member on Joe Biden's Presidential Transition Agency Review Team to support the transition efforts related to the Council on Economic Advisors. Can you talk about the economic priorities that the US faces today, especially in the wake of the pandemic? And also, what do you think are insights that one should possess to effectively serve on the Council of Economic Advisors?
Yeah, so I always have to say, I don't speak for any administration or government agency, so anything I say is, you know, my own personal views, not a policy, so whatever. So full disclosure, but I would say that, in my opinion, you know, with the pandemic, the health challenges that we face and reducing infections, getting people vaccinated and reaching stemming the spread of COVID, that's a key economic policy, you know, first economic policy that we face, which is what has to do with health. After that is achieved, if that is achieved, then I think the next step is that this has triggered a recession. And so thinking about how we have a recovery from a recession is important. I think one thing we learned from the Great Recession is that the things that the government can do to try to boost the economy, to try to help us get out of a recession. And then there's sometimes a fear like, oh, if the government does too much, you know, there could be some overshooting and some other things, that consequences like inflation and things like that. But those concerns probably caused us to pull off the pedal too soon after the Great Recession. Even the people who were leading economic policy back then said maybe we pulled back too soon. So I think it's important in this type of recovery to not do that same mistake. And then the other thing when we're thinking about these economic policies is like in aggregate, we could start to see unemployment go down or GDP grow. And that's going to mask inequality over certain subgroups. The unemployment rate, for example, the Black unemployment rate is usually twice as high as the white unemployment rate. So if we just look at the overall unemployment rate, we're masking this heterogeneity or these different effects, unequal effects across different subgroups. And so we need to look beyond just these aggregate measures when we're thinking about how to steer recovery. I think that if we can overcome the health challenges, we might be in a better position than we were after the Great Recession, because we were kind of in a slump because the financial market had crashed. Right now, our slump is a lot driven by the fact that this, you know, infectious disease is out there. If that is gone, maybe we don't have as much of an uphill battle, but I think that the policymakers still need to be very vigilant about what to do. And so yeah, I think the first and foremost, the best economic policy right now is actually public health policy.
Thank you. And could you go into more details about what one should possess in order to actually effectively serve on the Council of Economic Advisors?
Sorry, yeah. So I think I'll say like a lot of different government positions, not just the Council of Economic Advisors, but if you're working in the Treasury, the Office of Management and Budget, there's a bunch of different places where economists find themselves doing economic policy, the Federal Reserve. There's a big difference between academia and those types of policy jobs. And you know, the key difference is the pace. So in academia, I may decide like I want to answer a question, and from start to finish, from like the genesis of that idea to publication, it takes 5 years, easily. until it's like published. And then we're going to carefully do the research, and then someone's going to review it and trash it. Then we have to revise it, present it several times, try to perfect it, jump through a lot of hoops, publish this thing 5 years later. So whatever caused us to think about this study, 5 years later, you know, may or may not, you know, we can't really try to address things in a timely fashion with that type of academic research. We're trying to ask more general questions because this needs to be relevant even if the current motivation has passed. And it's entirely the opposite in government. You know, it's just a frenetic kind of high, like fast-paced environment. So they will come to you and say, like, I want to know about this feature of unemployment, and you know, we need to make, you know, you need to give us advice in a couple hours. So what do you got? And so you're being asked to do the skill set you need in that case is like, what is the best I can do with this limited amount of time? It's not like what's the best way to answer this question. It's like, can I take what is known, try to summarize it, distill it to key points? In academia, I'm doing a lot of nuance. You know, I'm doing a lot of this side, and this hand, that hand, and there's a third hand, and this hand. And in government, it's like, okay, here's like 3 bullet points. Here's what we know, what we don't know. My best guess is this. And then, because they have to make decisions. If you're working in administration, you know, the last 4 years, you know, there's a window where you have congressional support or whatever. And so it's just much more fast paced, and you have to be comfortable. You're not doing what's perfect, but you're trying to say, this is the best I can say. And the other thing is you're going to be asked to not be a narrow expert, to be a broad expert. I'm going to ask you about things, and you have to get comfortable saying, like, this isn't my expertise, but I can read and interpret other people's work and just try to summarize it for you. So I think those are some key things. And you're always like working as one part in a big machine. So you also are just like, you know, there's a document, this paragraph is you drop something in that place. There's a whole bunch of other people doing other stuff. Someone organizes it, pulls it together. So it's always like a big, like coordinated effort. And, you know, there's also, it's like a political environment. So you may say, you know, we have pressure to, there's different constraints in academia in terms of like what you're gonna say and advocate for and the constraints you face. In academia, can't say anything, but you can almost say anything. And just gotta go along, you know, especially if you have tenure, but not in a political sphere. There's just a lot of other costs to how you say things and what you say.
Thank you for that. And with that, we're at the time for the moderated Q&A session. So I'd like to open the floor to students now to ask any questions. In order to be selected to actually ask your question, I ask that you raise your hand in the participants section, and I will actually highlight you and spotlight you, and you will be able to unmute yourself and actually ask the question that you would like to ask to Dr. Jones. Who would like to ask the first question?
No questions. I answered them all.
Justin has one.
Hi, Dr. Jones. Again, thank you so much for being here and speaking with us. My name is Justin Douglas. I'm a third-year grad student doing a dual degree in social work and public policy. And my question really is about advocacy. As we sort of go through grad school, we're all sort of thinking about sort of how, and you talked about this, how our sort of life will sort of transpire and what goals we're setting and where we want to go and what impact we want to have. And I think like a lot of times, especially in academia, it's hard because it's somewhat removed from the quote unquote real world. What are some ways like in these academic spaces as we're sort of going through these processes that we can sort of sort of hold to sort of our desire for advocacy, what are some avenues that we can really sort of look to have our voices be heard and be a part of the advocacy and activism process?
Well, I would say that my experience in grad school, in part because I was in a doctoral program, it's like a long, it takes a number of years. It took me 5 years. It could take 6 years. It could take a long time. So I think, not speaking like, well, okay, and two ways I want to answer this. One is that part of what happens when you go to the university and you're studying a master's degree or getting a PhD or something like that, again, the model that they hold up for you is like a big transformative like impact. So, you come in part to inspire you, what you're presented with is like, look at this person that changed the way we think about, I don't know, the brain, this person invented artificial intelligence. So I think part of the frustration comes from using that as your like model for while you're in grad school. Like, I'm in grad school and maybe I should also, invent a new solar powered car or something. But I think while you're in grad school, it is okay to say, I have very modest, I'm gonna like focus very locally on being part of something while I'm in grad school to be grounded. And it may not, lead to overturning, decades of corruption and, some sort of like government agency or something like that. And it's okay if it doesn't, especially while you're in graduate school, because the other part of like having, I think part of it is like, it depends on your age. A lot of people in graduate school tend to be younger, and that's not everyone. But like, there's a lot, you just have, hopefully you have a lot of time after you get out of graduate school to live life. So, you don't have to do everything by a certain age. So also, do graduate school well, do it once to do it well. Part of advocacy is finishing your doctoral program. That's one way to have an impact, is to get out of the program. So I scaled back. I did a lot of things. I was very active as a student in undergrad. And when I was in my PhD program, I wasn't very active at all. And that was a sacrifice. That may not be the best way to do it. But in part, getting out is also a part of putting yourself in a position to do some of these things, and you have a long life to do it. So I think local, small impact is not the end of that's fine too. So, in part, and those things can grow to become very meaningful if you consistently are involved in some sort of community. So I think sometimes the challenge is like, I need to be in it, like, like Beto was saying, oh, I need to be in it. But you can be like in a very small, like, community action or activity, and it still could be very meaningful.
Thank you for that. I would also like to highlight that if you are uncomfortable asking your questions out loud, do feel free to direct message them to either me, direct message them to Justin Douglas, or also you can direct message them to Joshua McKeever, and we will be more than happy to ask those questions out loud for you. Maurice has his hand raised, so I'll highlight Maurice.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Thank you so much for the presentation. I really liked everything that you had to say about the winding road and so on, and not knowing what impact you're going to have. But I wondered, especially since you are in a field where there are so few people of color and even fewer Black folks, were you able to find mentors at certain points who didn't share your background and experience? And how did you know those people were in your corner, or how did you seek them out? How did you grow to trust them?
That's a good question. I think that I basically like a lot of that. I think some of that came from intuition. And what I mean by that is like there are people who don't have the same background as me, but I just felt more comfortable around them and I didn't feel as on guard. And I don't think there's any one thing that you can say that'll point to this is the person that you should look for. But I think you kind of know, like, it may be very subtle, but you might say, like, okay, when I'm talking to this person, I can kind of be honest. I told them about my upbringing and, or like, why was I willing to tell that person about that? And I don't really like trust a lot of these people in this space. So I found myself, I think when you notice that, you just kind of try not to discount that type of feeling you have. There's just going to be people who seem like more reasonable and, you feel a little more disarmed around them, and that's not always going to be the case. But I think like there have been people who I found like that who weren't Black throughout my career in different places that I've been, and I couldn't let the fact that they weren't Black be the only deciding factor. There were just other cues that I got in some cases where I'm like, this person is cool, and they. The other thing is like you kind of have to kind of you have to take what you can get. So basically, some people are it's gonna be clumsy sometimes, and so sometimes it takes grace because some people try too hard to be an ally to you, and you're like, you don't stop texting me about the summer of racial reckoning, like please. Let's just maybe it's just okay if we just get coffee and not talk about that right now. But part of it is it will take a little grace to give some people some space to be clumsy like that sometimes, because I think that there are cases where I don't really have the full understanding of someone's experience, and I know for sure I can like put my foot in my mouth and be try to be helpful and do not be successful at it. So I can definitely empathize a little with that. So I think you have to say, okay, sometimes this isn't the perfect comrade, but this is a comrade in this space, and also like and then inbound, like with like what's the word I want to like there's going to be like measured doses of their allyship, and they're like, okay, let's spend some time together, but let's also have some boundaries. And so I was lucky to find people like that. I don't think I was able to convert people into that role, but I was able to maybe just try to pick up on when I felt like someone might be okay, even if there was it's not perfect. And so I was like in an imperfect position and accepting that.
Thank you for that. Go on to the next individual that has their hand raised to ask a question.
Yeah. First of all, thank you, Professor Jones. My name is Donovan. I'm a second-year MPP student over at Harris. And throughout both the prepared remarks and the Q&A, you've at various points talked about sort of racial antagonism in the academy. You've talked about how long the process can be, and you've talked about the occasional smallness of one's work. So I'm wondering, with all that in mind, what keeps you going? Because I, as a student, am facing some of those challenges now. So given all that, how do you keep doing this thing?
I think there were like two things that somebody recently asked me this, and I'm gonna go with the same answer I gave them, in the sense that like I think if I look back for grad school, yeah, I would say that there were three things. So one was this motivation that I talked about, like partially when I went to grad school, it wasn't just to get a degree. It wasn't just to become a doctor or to have a doctor a prefix on my name. It was like, I was led to believe, and I convinced myself like, oh, if I do well, I can like be of a resource and be useful to some other people. And so I'm willing to put up with some of these things because I'm trying to aspire to these things. I talked about the pros and the cons of that type of like thinking, but that was part of the motivation for me. So that helped me to, that helped me some. I think the second thing was while I was going through graduate school, you know, I balanced, you know, I think that it was very healthy to have some other thing away from my studies that I did on a regular basis that was social and not fully related. I think you can get fully enveloped in that work, and then, you know, you can lose a little bit of perspective. So it's good to step away. It may seem obvious, like more work is what the solution will be to make this thing easier, but actually some distance, time off is actually really helpful. This wasn't something that I was aware of or maybe knew about when I was in graduate school, but like, you know, the one answer is always therapy. So that's just like a very practical thing. And it's not about like when you become in a crisis, then seek out therapy, but it's like day one, you know, actually when you are doing well or you feel well, it's probably the best time to start and just develop tools to maintain or to navigate when you fluctuate. And so that was not something that I knew about when I was in graduate school, but and looking back, you know, that I think I would recommend that to everyone. The final thing was like, when I'm thinking about in graduate school right now, like when I was in graduate school, I think I was just also lucky. Like I had some close friends. I had one close friend in general who was going through the same sort of path, but not the same path because he was a mathematician. So there's not that many Black economists, but maybe there's even less Black PhD mathematicians or whatever. So we were like really close friends in graduate school. And I think that helped because the person wasn't directly in my environment and position. And so, but they were along the same path. And so like, sometimes it would be like, I would be struggling, they would be succeeding. So it was like a jointly like, okay, at least somebody's doing well, or, you know, vice versa. So I had more wins to draw from than just my own wins and losses. I could say, okay, somebody's doing all right. And so I think that helped to push us along. So, you know, those types of things, those are things that got me through. Those are some things that got me through. If I look back at like what got me through graduate school, those are some of the key things. And a lot of those things weren't directly in my program or in my classroom, or, you know, a lot of things were external supplement, like things to help. With being a faculty member, yeah, it's just, I think the more that you are aware that if you're going into research, that there's going to be a long spell, there's going to be long spells where you don't know if any of the things you're doing is paying off. Maybe the more you can, you know, navigate that, but it's still hard to go through it. So I don't, you know, eventually things start to like pan out and fall into place, or they did for me, but there was a long time where it was like very challenging, and, you know, like continue to put in effort, but outcomes are very like delayed or, you know, forthcoming. I think I underestimated how that would be, but I think that the biggest thing is like, I was talking to some people because they were asking like, what's going to happen if you don't get tenure? Like if you're a faculty person trying to get tenure. And I think the biggest thing that can help people is to learn that if that happens, it will happen. And then what? And then you're going to keep, you know, you will continue. Like it's not the end of, there's no term. It's not like the termination of anything. Like on the other side of that type of experience, you're like, you realize that didn't happen the way I wanted it to, but there's so many other things, like, you know, there's so many other things that I can look forward to or value. So sometimes with academia, you've got all your eggs in one basket, like for example, tenure. And you may not be able to really recognize until maybe you get rejected for tenure or something, that it's like, that can happen, but you know, there's other, actually all the while, there's been other things that have been important to me. So it's not just about this one milestone. So I would think those are some of the things that help. And again, other things that would make your experience much better are the change in the environment that you're in. And it's just like, it's hard to understand how that could happen in the short run, like before, you know, within the next month or two. So these are survival things in the meantime. In the long run, these environments need to do better by the students and the faculty.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks. And at this time, we are at the 30 minutes past the hour. And so Dr. Jones, I was wondering, do you have any final remarks that you would like to make for the audience, or any final takeaways that you would like for the audience to know?
Well, I guess the only thing that's been on my mind is not about the general topic. It's more like specific. I think just at this point in time, like, we have a lot of students or faculty or, you know, other people on this call, staff, and I just think that everybody should definitely not feel that there's anything wrong with themselves with the current environment, the current situation we're in. The current situation that we're in is immensely difficult, not just for the students, but also for people who are working for you, like the staff members. And it is okay if this doesn't feel normal. Like, I think I was actually talking to someone earlier today, and they were saying, like, as time has passed during this pandemic, people have started to get back to their normal expectations about what you should be able to deliver. And, you know, it's not clear that having been in a pandemic for a year, I'm going to be better poised to do things. I may be worse off than I was in the initial, like, last spring. So it's been almost a year, and it's perfectly understandable if things are harder than they normally are, because why would they be easier? And so anything that we used to do now takes more work. And so to keep at a normal pace is actually is going to require an abnormal amount of effort. And so maybe that shouldn't necessarily be our expectation. So that's not specifically about like Black History Month. That's just about like Black History Month 2021.
No problem. Thank you so much for your remarks, Joe. Thank you so much. And at this time, I'd like to end the event. Dr. Jones, it was a pleasure having you, and it was a pleasure serving as the moderator for this event. In the chat, the Black Grad Coalition would like to know your thoughts about the event. So recently, Justin Douglas dropped a survey link in the chat. So please do feel free to provide us any feedback that you have on the event, anything that you want, any feedback at all that you have for Black Grad Coalition. We are glad to hear your voices. And also, the Black Grad Coalition will be putting on a movie night on Friday, this Friday, where we watch One Night in Miami. And you could look towards the newsletter to actually get the Zoom link in order to watch One Night in Miami together as a group. I would also like to thank the Organization of Black Students, OBS, for their assistance in advertising for this seminar. And I would also like to thank MIPS and BAPS again for your committed efforts. And in the chat, I will post their Instagram account, so that way you guys could go ahead and follow them. And please do follow the Black Grad Coalition as well. And the link to the Black Grad Coalition Instagram will be posted shortly. And I ask that people stick around so that way we could take a group photo at the end of this event, if time permits. So thank you again, Dr. Jones, for your time. And please do take a few minutes to stay with us.
Thanks for having me.